It was supposed to be a routine interview, just another night on a soundstage. Another camera-ready exchange between host and guest. Another chance to sell a movie, crack a few jokes, and go home. But the moment Samuel L. Jackson stepped onto the set of Jimmy Kimmel Live that Thursday night, the energy in the room shifted. Not because anything had happened yet, but because something already felt off. The audience didn't notice it at first. They were cheering, clapping, excited to see one of Hollywood's most recognizable actors walk across the stage. Jackson gave them the familiar wave, the signature presence. He sat down. He smiled. But Jimmy Kimmel didn't start with a welcome. He started with a smirk. "So," Kimmel said, flipping his cards without looking up, "do you ever stop being angry?" The crowd chuckled, unsure whether it was a joke. Samuel L. Jackson blinked once, slowly, then leaned slightly forward in his chair. "Excuse me," he asked, not raising his voice. "I mean," Kimmel went on, shrugging casually, "you've been going off a lot lately. Speeches, interviews, panels. Seems like you're always on a mission these days." Jackson didn't answer right away. He looked at Kimmel. He looked at the audience. Then he looked back at Kimmel. "My mission," Jackson said calmly, "is honesty." Kimmel nodded, feigning interest. Right, he said. "But don't you think maybe people just want to be entertained? Isn't that your job?" It was a small sentence. But in the silence that followed, it grew heavier than it sounded. Samuel L. Jackson didn't move. "I've been entertaining people for 30 years, he said. "I've played heroes, villains, preachers, killers, and kings. But I've never been told that honesty wasn't part of the job." The crowd clapped softly. Kimmel smiled tightly. "I'm just saying," he replied. "Maybe the politics should take a back seat. Especially when people are tuning in to have a good time." Jackson's expression didn't change. "You invited me here," he said. "You brought me out. So if you're uncomfortable with what I have to say, maybe you should ask yourself why you asked me in the first place." The audience stopped clapping. There was no dramatic pause. No shouting. No escalation. Just stillness. The kind of stillness that happens when the air in a room changes and no one wants to be the first to acknowledge it. Kimmel looked down at his cards, then tossed them to the side. "Okay," he said, "let's talk about your new movie." But Jackson shook his head. "No," he said. "Let's talk about why you felt the need to start this conversation by questioning whether I'm allowed to speak about things that matter." Kimmel glanced toward his producer. The camera stayed locked. And suddenly, the segment wasn't entertainment anymore. It was exposure, not of Jackson, but of the space itself. A space where certain guests are welcome as long as they smile, nod, and play along. And Samuel L. Jackson was not interested in playing along. Not tonight. Not anymore. The audience didn't know whether to laugh, clap, or stay silent. Samuel L. Jackson hadn't raised his voice. But the calmness in his tone made the moment louder than any outburst could have. Jimmy Kimmel tried to move on. He picked up a different card and read the name of Jackson's upcoming film. "So, tell us about the new role," Kimmel said with forced enthusiasm. "You're playing a retired Navy captain, right?" Jackson didn't answer immediately. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, eyes still fixed on the host. "I'll talk about the role," he said. "But I'm not going to pretend this conversation didn't start the way it did." Kimmel laughed awkwardly, motioning to the crowd. "I think they're ready to hear about the movie, Sam." "It's Samuel," Jackson corrected. The air went cold. It wasn't the name that changed the tone. It was the boundary, and Kimmel had just crossed it again. Jackson sat forward. "The character I play in this film," he said slowly, "is a man who gave his life to a system that forgot him. A man who stayed silent for years until he realized that silence never earned him respect, only permission to be ignored." The audience listened carefully. "I took this role," Jackson continued, "because I know what that silence feels like, and I know what it costs." Kimmel nodded, fidgeting with the pen on his desk. Sure, he said. "But don't you think some people tune out when actors get political? I mean, let's be honest. You're here to sell a movie, not a message." Jackson's gaze didn't waver. "Then maybe you invited the wrong guest," he said. No one laughed. No one clapped. The silence was complete. Because it had become clear, this was no longer about publicity. This was about power. The power to shape a conversation. The power to decide who gets heard. The power to define what entertainment is allowed to include. Jackson folded his hands in his lap. "Here's the truth," he said. "People like you don't mind when actors speak. as long as they say something you already agree with. Kimmel opened his mouth to respond, but Jackson continued. You joke about politics every night. You pick apart speeches. You call out senators. You ridicule decisions made by people who affect real lives. He paused. But when I talk about injustice, suddenly I'm off topic? There was no sarcasm in his voice, just clarity. Kimmel tried to reclaim the segment. Look, I respect your work, he said. I just think there's a time and a place. And you think I don't know the difference? Jackson replied, that I'm confused about why I'm here. The host froze. And in that stillness, the audience began to shift. A few people nodded. A few leaned forward. Not because they agreed with Jackson's politics, but because they recognized something real. This wasn't a stunt. This wasn't rehearsed. This was a man refusing to be reduced for the sake of someone else's format. Jackson took a breath. If you want to talk about the film, we can. But don't ask me to pretend the rest of me doesn't exist. Kimmel hesitated. He looked toward the control booth, then back at his guest. And for the first time all night, he had nothing to say. Samuel L. Jackson didn't raise his voice. He didn't point. He didn't stand up. He didn't need to. Because the weight of what he was saying was no longer directed just at Jimmy Kimmel. It was pressing against the room itself. This isn't about me being political, Jackson said. This is about me being whole. And if that makes you uncomfortable, then the problem isn't my voice. It's your filter. There was no applause. No band cue. No witty transition. Kimmel shifted in his chair. The cameras were still rolling, but the tone of the show had changed so sharply that even the crew behind the lights had gone still. Look, I didn't mean to offend you, Kimmel said, trying to keep the conversation from slipping entirely out of his hands. I just think people come here for a break from all that. Jackson nodded once. And people come to me for the same reason. Escape. Story. Strength. But they don't expect me to cut myself in half to give it to them. Kimmel leaned back. I don't think anyone's asking you to cut yourself in half. You just did, Jackson said. When you asked me to stick to the movie and leave the rest outside. That sentence didn't carry anger. It carried balance. Like someone who had been down this road before, too many times to count, and no longer had the energy to pretend it was about anything else. Kimmel exhaled and looked out toward the audience. You know, he said with a nervous laugh. I think I'm the one being interviewed here. Jackson smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It's not an interview, Jimmy. It's a mirror. And maybe you don't like what's looking back at you. For a moment, the crowd wasn't sure what to do with that line. It wasn't a punchline. It wasn't an attack. It was a truth no one expected to hear under studio lights. Kimmel reached for another card, then stopped. The cue in his earpiece was buzzing. The segment was almost over. Commercial break was seconds away. But he hesitated, because no commercial could cleanly cut this moment. Samuel, he said, quieter now. I think we got off on the wrong foot. Jackson didn't blink. We started exactly where you led us. The red light on the camera blinked off. Commercial. Applause signs flashed. The audience clapped out of habit. The music played. But backstage, the silence was real. Producers huddled. Assistants scrambled. One executive picked up a phone. Jackson stood up and stepped away from the desk. Kimmel didn't follow. He sat still, staring at the floor, the same way someone stares at a line they didn't realize they were about to cross, until it was already behind them. When the lights returned, Samuel L. Jackson was no longer on stage. His chair was empty. The applause sign flickered again. And still, no one clapped. When the show returned from break, the energy didn't come back with it. Jimmy Kimmel sat alone behind his desk, adjusting his suit jacket with small, uncertain movements. Samuel L. Jackson's seat was empty. His name still lit on the screen behind them. But the man himself was gone. Welcome back, Kimmel said, his voice thinner than before. We were just speaking with Samuel L. Jackson, who, had to step away. The camera cut to the audience. Blank expressions. Some curious, some uncomfortable. A few still trying to understand what they had just seen. No laughter. No applause. No exit music. Just absence. And the strange weight that comes when someone refuses to perform the way they were expected to, and instead chooses to leave the room altogether. Backstage, Jackson stood with his publicist. No shouting. No spectacle. Just stillness. One producer approached. We're sorry, the producer said quietly. That wasn't supposed to go like that. Jackson looked him in the eye. It went exactly how it was supposed to go, he replied. Then he left. Not escorted. Not forced. Just done. Outside the studio, word began to spread. Clips circulated within minutes. Not because Jackson had exploded. Not because Kimmel had said anything outrageous. But because what had happened didn't follow the rules of a late-night show. There was no punchline. No viral moment manufactured for entertainment. It was just one man refusing to be reduced. And another man realizing, too late, that the stage was no longer his to control. Social media didn't erupt in outrage. It simmered. People watched and rewatched the interview. Not for drama, but for something else. A quiet confrontation that had nothing to do with shouting and everything to do with dignity. You don't have to yell, one viewer posted. You just have to hold your ground. Others shared quotes. The line about silence not earning respect. The moment Jackson corrected his name. The sentence about filters and who decides what belongs on the air. Kimmel said nothing for the rest of the episode. He made it through the remaining segments. He told a few jokes. He introduced the musical guest. But his rhythm was off. His tone, uneven. Because the interview he thought he was hosting had slipped away. And the person he thought he could challenge had walked out. Not as a headline, but as a man unwilling to negotiate his worth. That moment would not trend for outrage. It would not go viral for spectacle. It would sit in people's minds quietly, the way certain truths do. Days later, Jackson posted a single sentence. Some conversations deserve silence. No hashtags. No commentary. Just that. And for once, no one argued. No one needed to. Because everyone who watched had already heard what wasn't said.